Her mini keynote circled around post-socialist dislocations. She pertains that dislocations often disrupt coherent scientific and political narratives, producing nuisance and irritation among knowledge producers. Professor Trubina reminds us that we need to think of the act of dislocating together with dislocating geographies and their users, exemplifying a point with the post-socialist space. She utilizes the lens of mega events to illustrate this point. Mega events translate neoliberal economic interests into urban landscapes that are socially, politically, and economically marginalized. How then are we to answer to this double dislocation, especially as precariously employed scholars in a continuously globalizing neoliberal academia? Pavel, our first presenter of the day, takes on Russian deathscapes as spaces that are under-researched and exotified. Pavel looks at ordinary deathscapes such as cemeteries and identifies three relevant processes: densification, large-scale improvement of public space, and national memory and memorialization. Using a combination of approaches, including focused ethnography and applying a multitude of disciplinary lenses, Pavel asks what the strengths and weaknesses of this open methodological approach are in terms of potential for comparison, coherence, and learning. Professor Trubina in particular drew attention to one of the methods used by Pavel, which he calls blitz interviews. Very short interviews with cemetery visitors in public space. Professor Trubina argues that these short interviews can provide very important and poignant insights. She also draws attention to the role of religious commemorations taking place within the orbit of Christianity. What happens on these days? How does the deathscape change into possibly even a site of celebration, from a place of mourning to an event space with glimpses of joy? We were also interested in the question how the study of deathscapes fits into the field of urban studies, or doesn't even have to fit. What is urban about death, dying, and its materialization in space? Without wanting to sound macabre or dark at this point, we think that especially in a time when particularly big cities around the world, New York, Paris, Madrid, Manaus, or Istanbul, are hit by the corona pandemic particularly hard, the question of deathscapes and the city becomes even more transient. Are our cities defined or marked by death, or as to reference Professor Turina? Josefa then, in the second intervention, specifically focused on the method of urban digital ethnography in her work of Brazilian favelas in Rio de Janeiro, which she describes as the only possibility for affordable housing for a large group of urban dwellers. Departing from urban security studies and the theoretical premise that power relations shape how we experience urban space and what sort of spaces we are exposed to in the first place, Josefa used digital ethnography also as a result of the very unpredictable situation the COVID pandemic has propelled us into. So how can we actually carry our research from the analog to the digital world? As she postulates, the internet produces knowledge, but what kind of knowledge? Another question comes up: what do we do when we have no spatial experience of a space at all before we start our research? Can we legitimately write about a space that we have no analog, no real-time experience of? Could this even be an interesting endeavor? Professor Trubina asked whether stigma can provide a useful sociological conceptual resource for understanding the favela. She also, in a somewhat similar way, questioned how favela residents relate to official favela discourses about them. How do they feel about themselves, and how do their perceptions differ from the views of outsiders looking in? Our third intervention by Sven Daniel asks how we can do ethical and safe research in authoritarian contexts. He reminds us that authoritarianism is not a static category, but something felt on the body, directing the rhythm of everyday life. Accordingly, authoritarianism is a practice that must be seen on a spectrum. He uses Cindy Katz's minor theory approach to understand minor moments of authoritarian practice. Looking at ordinary spaces in which ordinary things take place, such as meeting friends, hanging out in a bar, or landing in an airport, he maintains that the ordinary can easily become extraordinary in the shadow of authoritarian practices, interacting within a multi-scholar constellation. Professor Trubina, reminding that authoritarianism is the norm in the world, not the exception, then, among other things, asked whether and how we need to interrogate what we mean by authoritarian practices without overstretching the concept. Do we need to go to the in-between spaces of the so-called global East to experience authoritarianism? Or, as Sven seems to suggest, can we maybe look in the West and North through the experience we gather from the East? an experience that reveals to us the minor and major moments of authoritarian practices in all geographies, including the digital world. So what is our normal way of being in this world as it stands today, neoliberal, exploitative, and hostile to the earth that hosts us? Veronica looks at migrant youth in Argentina. She conceptualizes this group as young people in movements, since traveling between cities and countries on the continent seems to be a regular practice. She, among other methods, uses narrative cartographies for her research. The young people draw their own maps, manipulate existing maps, and enhance them with their narrative nodes circling around the sensation of danger. Among other things, she finds that forms of migrant mobility prompt different forms of spatial governance and securitization, as well as novel forms of urban violence and danger, including paramilitary activities. Professor Trubina then asks what the relation between state actors and perpetrators of violence are. Enthusiastic consent, attempts to control and curtail, or is there even that binary? And how does the concept of institutional violence that Veronica proposes act as a catalyst for producing counter-hegemonic narratives on violence? Lastly, how deep do we need to dwell into historical analysis to make sense of urban phenomena? This reminds us a little bit of the debates we had in the first workshop, where one of our discussants urged all of us to historicize more astutely racial categorizations, violence, and racism as a system of oppression.
Yeah, I will continue then. The morning session's discussion continued with Professor Robinson's intervention in the afternoon, making a case for reformatting comparison for a truly global urban studies. She asked where the concepts come from and what we do with them. When and how do they become self-evident? This also goes into the heart of the question of what the urban is. Robinson suggests two tactics: genetic, thinking through relations and broader urban processes, and generative, starting from concepts or territories. However, how do we even determine the territories of urban politics and the production of the urban? Is urban a conjunction, like Shepard and Leitner suggested, or a distinctive one? Different tactics of global urban studies were evident in this session's papers on how we can conceptualize urban studies. Our first speaker, Clara, projected us to the megacity of Istanbul, namely the highly contested neighborhood of Ok Meydanı in the middle of political resistance, violence, and militarization at the same time of a state-led urban transformation projects. She works through the categories of spatial and temporal. She questions how does Ok Meydanı work as a reverse mirror in which buildings, places, practices that are meant to be temporary endure over long periods. Reflecting on her positionality, she carries us through the space of the Turkish Gecekondu, a locally specific form of squatter neighborhoods, in exploring gentrification and its materialization in the neighborhood space. This case study is not a way to show the specificities of a particular place, but to envision connecting lines and the possibility of relations through horizontal differentiation with similar processes happening elsewhere. For Robinson, then interrogated what role of the concept of gentrification plays in Clara's work. Sharing her thoughts on applying gentrification on Ok Meydanı and other places of the map of urban studies, Professor Robinson argued that urban development in Turkey seems to be linked to a nationalist endeavor that brings extractivist strategies of indebtedness, mortgages, and financialization to people's everyday lives. So where does the concept of gentrification lead us? To compare and globalize urban studies as contrasted with other or possibly related concepts. So if we stretch our terms too far and call this is gentrification and this is gentrification, don't we lose the insights of particularities? Clara concluded by referring to the power of the native language of the particular case study in producing powerful conceptualizations like gentrification or kentsel dönüşüm, urban transformation in Turkish. So in the afternoon, our second speaker, Camilla, engaging with informal settlement upgrading, urges us to see from the South, as famously posited by Vanessa Watson, conducting a relational experiment of comparison by dissembling practices, flows, and networks in 3 Latin American localities. She renders policies comparable and understandable across borders. Interrogating how urban planning practices, formality and informality are linked, she discerned technocratic rather than transformative approaches in the policies and responses to informal settlement upgrading. So Professor Robinson offered in Kamala's paper that the flow and the connection and the other is the distinctive assemblies. Camilla is taking each case study as distinctive assemblies. Distinctive historical changes and trajectories create the distinctive history itself, like politics of exclusion, which is the territory's active agency. So when you take the three case studies together, how will you make them talk to each other? So if you're looking at the informal settlement upgrading instead of neoliberalization, this can give new conceptualizations and theorizations. Our third speaker, Simona, reflects on what he summarizes as Southern scholarship, arguing that we must open our economic thinking of the urban. He proposes a more analytically multi-scholar and relational approach. He focuses on regions in the global north that have been historically othered, namely Southern Europe and Southern US. He suggests using the Lofton and Trulaw's three arguments for Southern urban critique. First, the South of the West is empirically different. The second, these regions have different intellectual and vernacular traditions that need to be accounted for in their terms. And the third one, the previous, points to interrogate the production of knowledge, and especially those theoretical categories produced on the grounds of empirical research made in core regions of the West and long used to explain the exceptionalism of the South, ending up in the trap of culturalism and often racialization. So subordination and domination are relational and changeable over time, with some geographies of the South being former colonizers or imperialists. Places are variously and simultaneously analogous and detrimentally opposed. So Professor Robinson in turn questioned the use of the South concept. So she asks, is it worthwhile to think about the urban through the concepts of scale? Isn't it also limiting us for comparative analysis? Simona refers to the power of using the concept of South and the multi-scholar analysis. And in many cases, the concept of the South has the power when we use it in terms of its history. Thus, Marxists and even anarchists refer to the relations of scale for a comparative analysis. Our last speaker of the day, Manatullah, relates her research to the discussed diffusion between the global South and the North concepts by conceptualizing Cairo as local yet global. She argues that the visualization of urbanism through media and other communication channels that plays a facade for the political economy. The first paper in her case is the planning curriculum, where she examines how the city is made visible for planning educators and students. Secondly, she looked at the planning practice to reveal the visions of professional planners. Thirdly, she looked at the planning politics to show the visions of the state and the developers. And in the last one, she examined the planning context from the visions of the general public. And the last one is she looked at the planning culture, showing that targeted versus and excluded public's visions. Professor Robinson brings the concept of the global South on the table to think through how do we specialize the discussions in different geographies of the South, in which Manatullah discussed. Robinson suggests one of the possible ways forward to go beyond researching the variegation of concepts like financialization and neoliberalization. Can we go back to Simona's relational understanding to go beyond variegated uses of the concepts? And how can we go back to dislocating some of the conceptualizations we inherit, such as neoliberalization? Through different cases, looking at the contingent paths and materializations, and through embarrassing incoherence, by bringing more cases to strengthen and enrich understanding, or analyzing cases that illuminate contingent explanations for variable outcomes. To conclude the first day of the discussion, we want to go back to the morning session's Q&A, where one question aroused a debate on to what extent alternative methodologies and research methods have the power to dislocate urban studies. While Veronica responded to this question by proposing alternative methodological tools as a subversion of urban studies, Daniel referred to his positionality as locating himself as a researcher in urban studies rather than dislocating. Thus, we think it is crucial at this point to take a pause and recall our invitation to dislocating urban studies and what we mean by that, specifically for this very workshop. Alongside the discussion of post-colonizing urban theory, there is a need to discuss the impact of research as a system of practices that limit methodology. What is striking for us is how the research on off-the-map geographies is seen as an urban exception are expected to adopt Eurocentric methodologies to be read, discussed, and even published. Researchers also find resistance when addressing issues on family geographies of urban studies using non-Eurocentric or otherwise marginalized lenses and methods. This workshop was for sure an invitation to contribute to the challenges and strategies deployed by researchers working with or open to engaging with alternative ways of critical methodologies beyond West-North Eurocentrism, who either locating themselves by subversion of or dislocating urban studies using creative conceptualizations. So we're looking forward to tomorrow's discussion, in which Defne will share the details with you.